So we said we'd come back to, but I suppose broadly speaking, knowing how an autistic person and neurodivergent person, how to know how to meet their needs, particularly when burnt out. So, we've come a long journey over the last couple of months, I think, from masking as a key topic for late discovery autistic adults and otherwise neurodivergent people to burnout, and often largely due to masking. But also, I think that's where we kind of arrived at was, and a couple of people asked questions in the meantime, even about this. It's like, but how do people know how to take care of themselves? Given that they're probably highly masked, not sure who they are, what they want, what they need, have maybe spent a lot of their lives even people pleasing, going along with other people's needs, ignoring their own needs, just haven't learned very well how to recognize their needs, validate their needs. And even the recognize piece, I think we touched on a couple of weeks back and said we'd return to things like, how to be aware of relevant emotions and how much is that a difficulty for autistic people, interoception, physiological signals, as a seemingly common difficulty. So, that's, I think, the territory. Anything you want to add or pick up there?
Yeah, no, it just shows, doesn't it, that self-management involves such a lot of things, because you've got the political landscape in the first place of technically being less powerful or less impactful because of the power imbalance, let's say. But even if that didn't exist, there's a case of, well, do I even know what I feel, and how much of that is related to nature and how much of it is related to nurture?
Yeah. And it's a good point, and it is something I think we touched on last time. Somebody was saying about, it's like even an autistic person all on their own, in their own house where they live alone, may find it really difficult to answer the question, what do I need to do right now to take care of myself, particularly if I'm burnt out? Now, society is always somewhere in our heads, obviously, but still, it was a good way of describing it, I think, because even then, it can be really difficult. Now, I can do whatever I want today and whatever I need, but because that's my weekend, and now I want to recover and I want to relax and I want to nourish myself well, in both literally and figuratively. But do I know how to do that? Do I know what I need? What'll help me?
Or even if I need something, because it's not just about occupying oneself, is it? Or meeting one's own needs, but also responding to yourself, say. So if something's up, sometimes I'll say, I knew something. I didn't know what the something was, but I knew something, somewhere, something had changed in some way. And I had to then, now what I'll do is I'll take time to figure it out systematically, working through lots of like questionnaires, really, that, is it this? Is it that? Do you feel something, what behaviorally, how are you behaving? Are you restless? Are you doing so? I might quiz myself to try and figure out, am I in a particular state? Because something is different. And what might I need if I don't know what it's related to, or what I'm feeling in that time? I might talk about what I can do right now. What do I need right now? Do I need to go out? Do I need to stay in? Do I need to speak to someone?
Yeah, and I think what you're saying there highlights for me something we were saying just before we came on air, which is there's no simple answers to all of this. It's difficult. And if you take burnout, for instance, if you assume that the person actually is burnt out and maybe even knows they're burnt out, maybe they've got that information, it can still be very hard to figure out what you need. I mean, on top of everything else, you can have a brain fog and, exhausted mind. I mean, the context that we're doing these discussions in is as therapists in this area. And I suppose one of the things that it reminds me of before we go back to, some of the details is that a lot of the time this stuff just really is hard to figure out on your own, and this is where a therapist can be really, really helpful, to just both gentle questioning and trying to find out what's going on emotionally, cognitively, physically in the person's life, in their environment, but also maybe even just possible suggestions. I find myself just saying things like, look, I'm not saying this is what you need, but let me just start brainstorming and throwing in some examples of what some people find helpful to restore themselves a bit when they're so burnt out. Because at least then when they hear something, they can respond to it. They can say, well, no, not that, but I used to enjoy this or something, So it's that whole territory of what do I need? It's huge.
I think suggestions are useful, actually. I do think they are, because often that can give the client something to test in their mind, So you might say, well, so are you saying that this happened, and then it caused such and such a surprised reaction in you, and that you thought then that had always been happening and you hadn't realized until now? Do you think that could possibly leave you feeling a little worried about it, or anxious or angry potentially? And they might say, oh, not angry, but certainly I do feel a bit worried about it happening again in the future. So that probably is anxiety.
Yeah. And I think this is some of the territory then that we can be helpful with, but also, gradually help clients learn to be better at doing a bit of it for themselves. And I'm a fan of menus, saying, well, I wonder, is it, anger, anxiety, boredom, because it gives them something to bounce off, or even in terms of needs, it's like, well, do you need to get out and get fresh air? Do you need to scream at the wall? Do you need to and just throw out some examples of anything that sometimes people might find helpful, and then it does it kickstarts a bit of thinking. But of course, the general kind of how do you feel question of therapists covers a mixture of what we label as the emotions, like sad, guilty, depressed, but also covers feeling in the sense of tired, exhausted, hungry, things like that. And there's no neat line between those two territories. But I think it that to my mind brings us back to one of the bits you said we'd come back to, which was that can be difficult territory for lots of people and less difficult territory for other people. But there does seem to be a history of concern around difficulty naming, identifying emotions. Alexithymia, technically, seems to be a history of seeing that, or thinking there's a lot of that in the autistic and neurodivergent world. Now, I think nowadays the kind of thinking around that is not quite so extreme. I think it used to be a little bit like no autistic people can identify their emotions. Alexithymia is almost universal. I think there's been a very major withdrawal from seeing it that way. But I think the received view mainly is that it's still probably more common. Alexithymia, difficulty assessing emotions and naming them, identifying them in autistic people, and possibly connected with that, interoception difficulty accepting those physiological feelings, like just pain in your stomach, or hunger, or tiredness even. So what's your experience of that working with people?
Absolutely agree. I think that the sensory the sensations from one's internal system, we can be oversensitive to things or undersensitive to something, and picking up bodily signals can give us information about how we feel. That might lead to, say, if I've got an increased heart rate and a tight chest, for example, it might help me to know what I'm feeling. It might give me some information, some emotional related information about my life, or about my experiences, my responses. And without picking up that my heart rate has changed or my temperature's changed, I wouldn't necessarily easily get that information. at that time, especially if I'm trying to also process what's going on in the moment, and maybe with a mono focus of, trying to focus on the other person or the situation and of my internal world all at the same time. It's quite challenging.
Challenging, for, like you talked about sort of nature and nurture there a few minutes ago, challenging maybe because of some, innate aspects of, autistic neurology, like monotropism. But also I wonder how much the difficulties around interoception and emotional kind of, identification are to do with learning, or rather lack of learning. In other words, nobody's born able to identify emotions or sensations and put names on them. Well, for start, they don't have names or words, and then gradually as we grow up, we learn words for things, but then it's not that hard to imagine how somebody learns the word for chair, because they're just told, well, sit on the chair or get off daddy's chair or whatever, and that's a chair. But, it's actually quite fascinating anyway with human beings growing up, how we learn to identify emotions. How do we learn that this thing inside us is called sadness or guilt or anger? Well, presumably through some sort of calibration by people outside us. Like they see the angry look in our face, or we're stamping our foot and they say, God, you're very cross today, you're very angry, or are you sad about that because we're crying or are dejected or whatever. But that process, to my understanding, doesn't happen well for neurodivergent people growing up. It might if it's known that they're autistic or have ADHD and people know how to deal with that, how to adjust to it. But I'm presuming, from everything from my own experience to client experience to the research, that kind of process of finding out what's going on inside by other people kind of responding appropriately to it, presumably almost always goes less well for autistic people. So I do wonder, it makes me wonder what in 30 years time, like will this thing about alexithymia is very common in autistic people, and there's, high level of interoception difficulties. I wonder, will that fade a bit if people are helped better to identify as neurodivergent people what's going on inside them. But right now, as therapists, we mainly have a widespread extra difficulty perhaps in identifying exactly what we need to identify in order to take care of ourselves, particularly when we're struggling and burnt out.
And to be able to describe that experience in an emotional sense, I think is quite different to saying that there's no access to feelings, or that the feelings don't exist. We have an emotional life. We are human beings and we have emotions. They might be accessed differently or interpreted differently or expressed differently. And actually, speaking about families, how emotional expression and communication does get modeled, as you say. Probably that's how the child figures out, oh, mummy's sad or mummy's something. Well, of course, if neurodivergent people might not necessarily think that it's important to describe their feelings. That's not the relevant part of the issue. Actually there's some other technical information is communicated, and that's what gets talked about, that's what gets modeled, if you like, that the person, the parent might be feeling feelings about it, but that doesn't take center stage, that's just a given, that's part of it, but not really put out on the table, so to speak. So then maybe the child would pick up that the same way of going about things. So the purpose of, or the relevance of, describing one's feelings might not have been picked up in the first place.
Which is something that can happen culturally anyway, sort of in perhaps Victorian upper class culture, or in certain families, all, leaving aside neurodivergence altogether, people don't automatically learn make use of feeling information. But I do think, there may be a particular sort of mismatch then when it comes to neurodivergent children. You're saying, Rachel, that this makes sense, the difficulty in knowing where to look inside oneself to get the information needed. And I do think that's part of a bigger picture of just not being validated as an autistic person, and like the notion, by the way, that you touched on there, that like the mad notion that autistic people might not have emotions at all, which has been there, sometimes officially, definitely unofficially, and kind of coded characters like Data the android and people like that, or various Vulcans, with no emotion, are seen as like autistically coded characters, as if that's what an autistic person is, someone with no emotions. But I remember thinking, being a Star Trek fan when I was younger, and long before I knew I was autistic or anything, I was thinking in those terms. And I remember thinking, but folks, a creature with no emotions makes absolutely no sense, because a creature with no emotions wouldn't want anything. They wouldn't have any fear, so they wouldn't run away from danger. They wouldn't have any desire for anything, So it makes absolutely no sense to have no emotions. It's just meaningless, Emotions are what motivate us, and give us vital information. Yeah. So
it does give us information. That's right. Yeah.
And that brings us back to go on. Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking about families in where the people have ADHD, getting very dysregulated. So there's a lot of people our age who are ADHDers, and their parents might have also been ADHDers, but not known. And maybe those parents got very dysregulated. So what looked like anger or frustration underneath could have been fear and sadness, actually. But the dysregulation can come out in a very, very energetic, frustrated sounding kind of energy, that seems forceful, seems powerful, but underneath that person could be feeling frightened and disappointed or bereft, sad.
Absolutely. And that brings us back, I think, to kind of a bit of that emotional psychoeducation piece. And like, I find it can be really, really useful just to describe and model and give written information on emotions and their purpose, their evolved purpose. How to even sort of, for the moment, deduce your probable emotion, because emotions are contextual. They're and I think that's a lot of the very interesting thinking in the field of neurodiversity is going a bit that direction anyway. It's not leaving behind the psychological, but it's moving very much into the sociological and the social systemic domain, and like emotions are contextual. They're not just in your brain, in your body. They're there because you're in a context you perceive as dangerous. Therefore, you feel fear, or where you feel, according to the world I'm in right now, I've done something wrong, so I feel guilty, And so, you can kind of start to even help people just to identify retrospectively as well what some of the emotions are. With sometimes, again, bringing us back to these kind of tough questions that people are asking about. Well, when someone's burnt out, because like, in a way, we put burnout on the agenda, and so we're trying to respond to the questions then of like, how do we help people? Is the feeling positive or is it negative is a good starting point, I often think, for people who are struggling with emotions. Like, for start, is it good or bad, and how good or bad is it? And we can tease it out, parse it out later in a bit more detail. But if you're feeling really bad, and you can put some rough words on it, like, I just feel stuck and awful and hopeless, then fine. Like, you don't always need to tease it out in great detail. Yet I think one of the questions we were sort of trying to move a bit closer to was, what can people do for themselves, even as a starting point? And that is still a tough question, because there aren't much, I think, in the line of very general rules. It's still very individual. Knowledge of the autistic and neurodivergent territory helps the therapist and helps the client, but in the end of it all, it's still very individual. It's not transferable necessarily from one autistic client to the other. And you were talking a little bit about this before we started recording. I think, that it's like one person might, need to sit in an almost empty room in order to self-regulate, and another person that might freak them out. One person might like to sit, quietly in a room for a while with their familiar belongings, but another person that might just trigger things they need to do because that needs tidying or whatever. One person might want music, one person might hate it, one person might need some company, one person might need solitude. So I'm not trying to make it impossible, but the reality is it's very individual still, isn't it?
And it can be multi-layered as well, can't it? Because you can have a state, you can be in a state of being about being the person who's in the situation that you feel feelings about. So it's like maybe you have to solve that one first. In other words, I feel something's happening. I don't know what it is. But ideally, I'd take care of myself and get myself in a reasonably comfortable state or a functioning state of some sort, or a rested state, depending, as you say, depending on what it is and what's the issue and what needs to happen instead. And then be able to figure out, well, what might have caused that? What conditions have I been in? What situations? What may have happened? What might I have imagined or anticipated? And then what do I feel about that? And then whether I can do anything about that emotional need based on that. I always use mad, sad, scared and glad. So if I'm glad, there's nothing necessarily to solve there. If it's genuine happiness or joy. If I'm angry, then it's because I need something repairing or apologizing for, have a need for being something to be put right because something's been damaged. If I'm sad, then I've lost something and I need comfort, proper deep loss, that can't be replaced. So it's about acceptance and comfort. If I'm scared, then what is the threat? I'm under threat of some sort, as you said earlier. There's a danger. Where can I get protection or make the threat go away? And that might be work that you do with the client once you got to figuring out what were the things in the first place that had caused something. But then the client may go into a lot of anxiety perhaps, or feeling very unsettled and not know what's going on because they don't it's all happened so fast.
Yeah, and that kind of exploration may, at the very least, help figure out a bit for the client what they ideally need less of for the moment. Maybe not what they need more of quite yet, but what they need less of. And that can be difficult. It could be like less of my job, and that means they have to talk to a doctor about a sick cert or whatever, if they can get that. But it can be, some of those feelings can really tell you, no, I absolutely, for a start, need to have no contact with that person for a while. Great. At least now we know. Maybe that's going to be a tough conversation, but at least now we know. Yeah. Maybe even just the outside world. Yeah. Maybe actually I just need to withdraw for a while because actually the thought of the outside world terrifies me. Yes, it's scared, And so sometimes, particularly when someone's burnt out, and at the very least, we might find out, oh, yeah, big emotional signals here telling you what you absolutely don't need. And often it's part, as you say, of what's put them in that position anyway, like the job or the relationship or whatever it is that has been so difficult for them and such hard work and so stressful. Yeah. So that's a good tip, I suppose, isn't it? Yeah. It's almost start with what you need, as they say, the approach and the avoidance emotions, the ones that make you want more of something and the ones that make you want less of something, so that the things you desperately need less of are a good starting point.
Yeah. And in terms of monitoring whether you are making any progress in recovering from burnout, say, then how there's a component about loss of skills as well as just an emotional.
That's right. Yeah. Cognitive skills. Yeah. It's cognitive impact. Yeah.
So it's noticing, I can read my screen again or something like that. That means that they're doing something right. So I'm getting some of my capabilities coming back. So we can monitor behaviors as well.
Yeah. And, what that reminds me of, and again, this might, kick off a few more topics, but, when it comes then to something like, well, I'm engaging with the screen again, and maybe I'm getting some fulfillment from that. Maybe I'm beginning to enjoy reading again, or enjoying watching my favorite TV show again. And that's a good sign, or at least the very watching of it is beginning to make me feel better, feel like I'm filling up rather than just being emptied all the time. What occurred to me was that it's useful then, given that particularly we're talking about autistic clients, it's interesting to think in terms of the 3 S's, which is the sensory environment, crucial. So, that's one of the things for autistic clients, is that extra attention needs to be given to the question of what do you need from a sensory point of view, though again, those aren't always easy questions. And how do they decide? Sometimes trial and review, sometimes just going back to some of the things they found difficult or safe or comfortable in terms of sensory environments. Then special interests, which we touched on last time, and again we need to come back to, but it's like, have you the energy to engage with something so that thing can nourish you? Sometimes you haven't, unfortunately, so that's pretty delicate. Or sometimes it had to be a very small version of something that you find really interesting. And stimming, that's quite a variable one. Again, it's more relevant to some autistic clients and less relevant to others. But sometimes some autistic people, at least when they're really at rock bottom, one thing that can kind of begin to get them back out of it sometimes is stimming, if they have some favorite stims that really help them, because it begins to shake up the energy, connect them a bit with emotion, even feel like the emotion is being expressed without putting any words on it, communicating something even to themselves, but also self-regulating, self-soothing in some kind of a way. So whether that's rocking or, a favorite song on repeat hundreds of times, or again, as I said, it's probably something for us to open up a bit more in its own right. But they're clues, I think, where to look, help people look. Sensory environment, passionate interests and stims.
And even playing music and doing like crafts or artwork, although it's an interest and a hobby, could also be seen as stimming. It depends.
Oh, totally. Yeah. No, yeah. Knitting, stim, No, stimming is very interesting from that point of view. And I think, maybe it is the one for us to pick up. But pretty soon, even next time. But yeah, like it's a much broader thing than people often imagine, and it doesn't have to be a bit like special interests. It doesn't have to be unusual things or things you notice people doing because they look a bit strange. It's just, and it isn't even always necessarily physical. It can just be in your head, or it can be in your headphones if you're listening to the same piece of music over and over again, for instance. But it's something that's kind of repetitive and soothing and self-stimulating. Stim just means self-stimulation. So it is. It's a pretty fascinating area, and one which is quite likely in a lot of people being fairly masked, maybe from a very early age even. So you never know what might be kind of resuscitated at some point in people's recovery journey. As a stim, Yeah, I'm exploring fidget toys at the moment. Yeah, I've always had a few. I have pens that I click. So they're not official fidget toys. I also break the bit off that is supposed to go in your pocket to hold it in. But anyway, but yeah, I'm exploring some fidget toys online at the moment. See if I'll buy a few. Because I do like to have something in my hands. But yeah, it's a bigger question, obviously, in terms of things like burnout recovery. And, I think that question of interoception is still maybe one for us to come back to a bit more, whatever about naming emotions, but even just what we can do. I suppose I'm kind of interested in this one because I think it's probably, not necessarily the aspect of the work that I'm strongest in or most familiar with, is that kind of physiological self-awareness. I don't ignore it and I do it, but still, after all, some therapists it's their primary work, somatic type of training and so on. It's about, much more about physical self-awareness. So it's an area that, it'd be interesting maybe to.
And we were talking, weren't we, before when we first talked about burnout and burnout recovery, that when clients are in session, to perhaps allow longer processing and possibly even doodling, so the client might be doodling, which of course is stimming, isn't it?
It's stimming. That's a form of stimming.
Yeah. While still they're still engaged in the conversation. They're still there, because they're not sort of checked out, but there's an aspect of the self that is engaged in something else. So there's a bit of a half and half going on, and that would be not necessarily a sign of avoidance or any other thing, but literally energy management or something like that the client is doing.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, that example, all right. Yeah, because managing energy, just helping focus themselves, calming themselves down a bit.
Yeah.
The various different functions. Yeah. I mean, that is another aspect of stimming that's interesting, is that often people think it's just something people do to manage a bit of stress or anxiety, and of course it often is that, but it's often more than that. It can be a way of self-expression. It can be a way of helping focus yourself. It can be manage your thinking, all of that. Yeah. So that's and I mean, maybe we'll learn over the next number of years, as we learn more and more about autistic and neurodivergent well-being, maybe we'll find that actually ideally stimming is a big part of it. Maybe more and more people will discover that actually, as an autistic person, I'm just really mentally healthier if I can stim a good bit, both for prevention and protection and also for recovery. Interesting to see how much of that is masked.
Well, I was just going to say that takes us back to the beginning, doesn't it, of our conversation today, where if people have been told don't do that or sit on your hands or stop moving around, then the signals to that in the beginning will have been switched off eventually. Because if I'm not allowed to do the behavior, if I'm not allowed to communicate it or respond to myself, then eventually I'll not stop noticing.
Definitely.